Dwelling and Indwelling, the house that God built. This is the sermon series we've started. This is now the third week of that series already. Boy, time flies, right? The first week, we talked about the very foundations of this house that we dwell in together with God. And that very foundation is our relationship with God. And this is a God that allows us freedom in this relationship to participate in what goes on in our living together in this house. So we actually have a say. We're not shackled to the powers and the principalities that be, having no say in what's going on or no real influence on what's happening, but rather we're in this together with God. And the second week, we talked about Solomon, the story of Solomon, and realized that the wisest part of what Solomon was all about was recognizing that his story and the story that he was called to be a part of by God is needing to be focused on as the main story of what he's living, rather than spreading himself so thin that he loses track of his story in the midst of other people's story. We all have our unique conversation going on with life, and keeping that story, the main story, is what keeps us on track, even though we have all these multi-layers of conversations with one another. That pillar of wisdom is one of many pillars that helps keep the house strong that God is building amongst us. Today we're going to be looking at the story of the prophet Elijah, who's working with a military commander named Naaman. And we're going to be looking at this story through the eyes of a second pillar within God's house, known as the pillar of humility. Let's listen to our story from 2 Kings.
Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man and in high favor with his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man, though a mighty warrior, suffered from leprosy. Now the Arameans, on one of their raids, had taken a young girl captive from the land of Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went in and told his Lord just what the girl from the land of Israel had said. And the king of Aram said, "Go then, and I will send along a letter to the king of Israel." He went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of garments. He brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you my servant Naaman, that you may cure him of his leprosy." When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to give death or life, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Just look and see how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent a message to the king. "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come to me, that he may learn that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and halted at the entrance of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go, wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman became angry and went away, saying, "I thought that for me he would surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and would wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" He turned and went away in a rage. But his servants approached and said to him, "Father, if the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, would you not have done it? How much more when all he said to you was, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he went down and immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. His flesh was restored like the flesh of a young boy, and he was clean.
The story of Naaman kind of blows apart a bunch of our ideas about not only what humility is all about, but how gods and kings and military commanders set about solving problems, fixing things. This story historically was written about the 9th century BC. And it was when Aram, the country of Aram, was neighbors with Israel. They weren't necessarily close neighbors, but they were neighbors, neighboring nations. And Naaman was the military commander of Aram, not an Israelite. And yet, Yahweh, the God of Israel, was the one given credit for all of Naaman's victories as a military commander. So what the story is telling us that Yahweh works through other nations besides Israel, even then. What also it's telling us is that kings and military commanders tend to solve problems by throwing money at it. Who figured, right? Naaman has a problem. He has leprosy, and they can't cure it. They don't know how. So being a beloved messenger or servant of the king throws all of his money and all of his support and all of his resources and all of his people behind Naaman and sends him off to a neighboring king on the word of a captured servant girl from Israel. How realistic does that sermon sound? All of the power, all of the resources, all of the money sent behind Naaman to ask a neighboring nation, not even a close nation, for help in solving something that they couldn't solve themselves. Kings don't really do that normally, right? I mean, this is a whole different kind of story. Kings, first of all, do they really admit that they can't solve something? And if they do, don't they usually find every kind of resource they can to solve it in a different way so they don't have to admit that? And military commanders, don't they have all these kinds of strategic plans about how they can go about fixing things without ever having to ask for help? And all of this advice comes from great experts, great advisors to the king and to the military, right? Not from servant girls from a different nation who most of the time they don't even notice. And yet all of this is being done on her word that there is some kind of wild-eyed prophet out there that might actually be able to help Naaman in his disease. This is kind of a crazy story. Even today in our world, we tend to solve problems in the way of kings and military commanders, right? Whenever we have a problem, we throw money at it. We throw all of our experts at it. We throw all of our resources to try to solve it. Everything we can do to admit that we don't know something, we're going to try to do. And yet in this story, we're being told that kings and military commanders are taking advice and wisdom from servants. Simple solutions to things rather than grand strategies for entitled people. Naaman and the king have to set aside everything they think they know about power, about resources, about connections, about public relations with neighboring nations. And they have to admit they can't solve this on their own. and they're looking to their neighbors for help. That's God's story. That's our story. Being able to admit that we don't know everything and that we need to ask questions in order to learn more and deepen who we are as people with one another. Greeting the other as a neighbor that can help rather than someone who can do us harm. That's a whole different kind of story. And setting aside all those things that we thought we were so sure about in order to be open to something altogether new as a possibility for living together, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about humility. Our stories up to this point have all had this sense of setting aside certainties in order to be open to something new that God is doing in the world. David had to set aside everything he thought he needed to be as a king in order to hear Nathan's voice calling him to task. Solomon had to set aside everything he thought he needed to do to be a great peacemaker in order to see that he was getting off track. He thought all he had to do was expand his alliances, lots different from his father, the warrior, in order to build peace and prosperity in his country. But setting aside that he knew everything and could fix it all himself, he realized that he had expanded too far and had lost track of who he was and whose God he was working with. Today, Naaman has to set aside his entitlement as a military commander, and the king has to set aside his pride in order to reach out to his neighbor for help. All of that setting aside is humility. And the word humility comes from this Latin word humus, that literally means earth. So to be humble means to bow down to anything that's higher than earth or God. But this is not a letting go of who we are. This is not a weakness. This is instead opening ourselves up to taking more in. From being self-confident enough to admit that we don't know everything, that we don't have to pretend like we do, and that instead we can rely on one another to be resources for one another, to learn something new, to open ourselves up to imagining possibilities beyond what our imaginations can envision, because it's coming to us from outside of ourselves. That's humility. It's not self-abasement. It's not saying that we're not important. It's saying that we're so important that we're connected with God and thus able to have the confidence to ask questions, to be living in a sense of perpetual curiosity that opens us up to whatever else might be out there. And by doing that, we're not saying we're less important. We're actually opening ourselves to being even more, even bigger, full of abundance and full of life and new possibility. Humility is not a weakness, it's a strength. And this is the pillar that God is pointing to, that as we greet one another in humility, we're open to living together, to hearing each other's stories, and to letting it affect who we are in a way that brings us together as neighbors. I first learned, well, lots of different ways I've learned about humility throughout my life, but one of the strongest ones I remember is when I had my first child. I was working with the National Lutheran Church in Chicago, of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And they were just beginning a study with a task force on theological education in this newly merged church. This church came together in 1988 as a combination of 3 other Lutheran churches that merged together into this new church of the ELCA. And in this newness of this church, they wanted to be able to dream together what ministry in the 21st century would look like and how they could best start training leaders for that type of ministry. So they gathered all these people together in this task force to do the study, and they needed someone to assist the study with a secondary theological degree, but only wanted to work part-time. So to have a master's degree in theology and only want to work part-time, it doesn't happen all that often. But I had just had a new baby, and I wanted the flexibility to be able to stay at home and to bring my child to work with me when I needed to be at work. We were the perfect fit. So I did go to work for the Study for Theological Education as their project assistant, and I sat with them in the midst of these conversations of these three church traditions trying to come together to dream. They had professors, they had presidents of seminaries, they had board members, they had constituents of the seminaries, they had treasurers and vice presidents of development at these meetings. I got to read all these great books and listen to all these fabulous stories. It was a great time to be the church because all kinds of new ideas were coming out and being thrown up in the air, hoping that some of them would stick. But in the midst of all this excitement was some terrible fear as well, and some dis-ease about the fact that these are three separate ways to be Lutheran in the world, trying to come together in a way that could collaborate. But they were so afraid that in merging together, they would lose the core of what their identity had always been. And they were worried that the pecking order of who got to make decisions for the good of the whole had somehow changed, and they had somehow lost their power. There were 8 ELCA seminaries throughout the country. 7 of the 8 are located east of the Mississippi River. Their fear was that the new church would try to spread them out, so close some down and spread them to different places. So it became known as the study on numbers and location. That's not at all what the study was about, but fear led people to believe that. So when we had conversations with presidents and board members and faculty members and everybody else, they came protecting their identity because they were afraid we were going to close them down. So I was listening to these conversations and thinking, oh my gosh, what they're missing. They're missing this opportunity to dream big and do something altogether different because they're so worried about the primacy of their own story. They're so arrogant. Why can't they get along? Why can't they see that this is a good thing to change and grow and see things in a different way? And I was so mad about that. The hardest part of my job in this whole study thing was sitting at these meetings and having to keep my mouth shut. How many of you know me well? That's the hardest thing for me, especially when I'm 28 years old. I know everything, and surely I could cure this in about 5 minutes if given the chance, right? The arrogance that they were bringing to these meetings was nothing compared to mine. I was sure I knew what to do. I was sure that I could run this better, that I could get them talking to one another, that I could get them to let go of their arrogance and be able to be free to open to new things, that it wasn't a bad thing, but it's what they knew, and it's who they were. They didn't want to lose that. So I remember seething at some of these meetings, thinking, oh my gosh, I can't wait. One of these days, not only am I going to not be the assistant who's taking notes, but I'm going to be sitting at these tables helping them make these decisions. And not only that, one of these days, that table is going to be mine. And I'm going to invite them in. Wow. Talk about arrogance. And it wasn't until much later on that I realized by being forced to sit and listen in those conversations instead of opening my mouth, which would have been a disaster, I actually learned how to appreciate stories. I actually learned that other people actually had something to say, that they brought with them ideas and love and passion for what they believed in. that they had possibilities that I hadn't even considered. And it was astounding to me that this particular group actually came up with so many cool ideas about what ministry in the 21st century was going to look like. In fact, they created the program that made it possible for me to return to ordained ministry 15 years later. No way I could have foreseen that. No way. I do have my own meetings now. I do sit at the table, and a lot of those tables are mine. But what I've learned is that I value and love just sitting there listening. I don't have to be the one talking. I want to hear what everyone else is saying. I want to hear ideas that I couldn't possibly dream of, because I know that I don't know it all now. My child grew up and told me that. I know that being part of living together with other people means being open to other new possibilities. That is why I have a sign on my door that says impending revelation. I'm standing on the edge of the 21st century waiting for something momentous to happen. That's a quote from Tom Robbins. It's being excited to hear what other people have to say. It's being able to set aside what we are so sure we already know, that we're open to something new. How many of you came to church today expecting to learn something new, either about Naaman, Elijah, humility, or yourself? How many of you came to affirm what you thought you already knew? Humility is being able to set all that stuff aside. Rachel Hackenberg was a guest on Darkwood Brew last Wednesday, and she was telling us about the spiritual practice of humility. And what that is asking questions. Living in that perpetual state of curiosity, we're able to open ourselves up and admit that we don't know everything and that we want to know more. So I'm going to ask you all to practice humility with me today. We have two different stations. We have one here that's all about washing your hands. And what this washing your hands is doing is literally, well, symbolically anyway, setting aside those things that you feel so certain about that you can let go of in order to learn something new, to be open to a different possibility of living. And then once that is accomplished, then in that openness, bring your questions that you wrote on your cards and drop those questions in this basket over here. And be confident and expectant that God's listening and is going to respond in some way that brings you to a whole new place of being. I'm going to invite Terry to come up, and Connie, I think, is going to help with the towels. And then the baskets are prepared, so please come. Practice humility, letting go of your certainty, and asking for help. Thank you for participating. I'm sorry if that makes us go over. You'll have to set aside your certainty of how long church ought to be. Humility is not a weakness. It is not self-abasement. It is living most fully into what you're capable of being in your humanness. It is being most fully who God created you to be. And that means living in a perpetual state of curiosity about everything around you. Being open to knowing more, deepening your relationships, and being a better neighbor to one another. The stories of the Bible are full of regular, ordinary people having the self-confidence to ask God, is this really the way things have to be? Is there not another way? Job. The picture of the wrestling is Jacob with the angel. The statue is Mary Magdalene. There are stories after stories about humility in the Bible. Not weakness, self-confidence. To be able to admit that you don't know everything and that you don't want to have to act like it. That's humility. Being open to somebody else's ideas that expand who we are together in this house that God builds. And God's greatest act of humanity and humility occurs in this meal, where Jesus humbles himself even to the point of death, and in his brokenness offers his body to us, that we might collaborate together in a world that is outside of what we originally imagined and leads us into new possibilities of life together. And after supper, he had given the cup, and he offered it to all to drink, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, shed for you and for all people." Because humility disregards kingships and commanders and wealth and privilege and entitlement, and brings us all to curious human beings living together with God in God's story. So this is for all people. And we eat and drink of this meal in remembrance of Jesus' humility for us. I invite the deacons to come and prepare this meal. And while they are coming, please know that you don't have to have a particular faith to participate in this meal. All you need is a yearning to know more and to be in relationship with God. And if you do decide to participate with us, please take a piece of the loaf being offered and dip it in the juice and take in the humility that God gives as a gift to each and every one of us, that our lives may be deepened and connected to God in a way that holds us all together, interdependent in coming up with all kinds of new creative ideas for living together in this house that God has built. Let us remember that as we set aside our certainties, we do not lose who we are or whose we are. Let us say together who we are. We are an open and affirming family of faith, welcoming all to God's table of love and acceptance. We are diverse, yet united by Christ's example. We care for one another, support one another, and challenge one another to become all that God creates us to be. We work together to nurture our community and to promote peace and justice in our conflicted world. Amen. These are the gifts of God for the people of God. Please come.